On December 8, 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York and delivered one of the most consequential speeches of the Cold War. The hall was packed, the tension palpable. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb just months earlier, and the world was gripped by the terrifying logic of mutual annihilation. The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future, Eisenhower declared, his voice steady and deliberate. That capability, already proved, is here now today. The address launched a program called Atoms for Peace, an ambitious American initiative to share civilian nuclear technology with allied nations across the globe, a diplomatic masterstroke designed to recast the atom not as a weapon of apocalypse, but as a tool of progress. Among the most eager recipients was Iran, then ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a close Western ally who had been restored to power just months earlier by a CIA-orchestrated coup known as Operation Ajax, which overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The Shah's vision for his country was relentlessly modernist. He dreamed of skyscrapers in Tehran, highways through the desert, and gleaming nuclear reactors powering an industrialized Iran that could rival any European nation. Washington didn't just approve it, actively helped. In 1957, the two nations signed a civil nuclear cooperation agreement under the auspices of Eisenhower's program, and by 1967, the United States had supplied Iran with a 5-megawatt research reactor known as the Tehran Research Reactor, or TRR, installed at the campus of Tehran University. Remarkably, this reactor was fueled with weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium provided directly by the American government, a detail that seems almost unbelievable by today's standards. American corporations, including General Electric and Westinghouse, were competing fiercely for contracts to build full-scale power plants on Iranian soil, viewing the Shah's petrodollar wealth as a golden opportunity. France and West Germany joined the fray with equal enthusiasm. The German firm Kraftwerk Union began constructing the Bushehr Nuclear Power Plant on the Persian Gulf coast in 1975, while France signed agreements to supply reactor technology and training. Stanford Research Institute produced a study for the Shah's government recommending a vast nuclear energy network, and at its peak, the Shah's plan called for 23 nuclear power stations that would generate a combined 23,000 megawatts of electricity, freeing up Iran's oil and gas reserves for export rather than domestic consumption. MIT, the University of Michigan, and other elite American institutions welcomed Iranian physics students, training the very scientists who would form the backbone of the program for decades to come. The Shah even established the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran in 1974, appointing Akbar Etemad as its first president, a French-educated physicist who later recalled that the Americans were practically begging us to buy their reactors. The irony is staggering and almost poetic in its cruelty. The very nuclear infrastructure that would one day terrify Washington was born in Washington. Then came 1979. And the world turned upside down with a speed that stunned even seasoned intelligence analysts who had assured President Jimmy Carter that the Shah's grip on power was firm. The Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from his peacock throne, replacing a secular monarchy with a theocratic republic under the austere and uncompromising Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had returned from 14 years of exile in Najaf and Paris, to be greeted by millions of rapturous supporters on the streets of Tehran. Diplomatic relations between Iran and the United States shattered almost overnight, crystallized by the 444-day hostage crisis at the American embassy in Tehran, where 52 American diplomats and citizens were held captive by revolutionary students who called the embassy a den of spies. Khomeini's rhetoric toward the West was scorching and absolute. "We are not afraid of your military might," he proclaimed. "We are not afraid of your economic pressure. Our youth are willing to die for Islam." Western contractors abandoned their projects in chaos at Bushehr, German engineers left behind a half-finished reactor shell and billions of Deutschmarks worth of equipment that would sit rusting in the Gulf humidity for years. Siemens, which had absorbed Kraftwerk Union, refused to resume work under American pressure, and the French similarly walked away. International cooperation evaporated, spare parts dried up, and the Tehran Research Reactor, still running on its original American-supplied fuel, began to face supply shortages. Khomeini himself initially dismissed nuclear technology as a relic of Western decadence and a symbol of the corrupted regime he had overthrown. Akbar Etemad fled into exile in France, and many of the Shah's nuclear scientists scattered abroad. But the brutal 8-year war with Iraq that followed ignited when Saddam Hussein launched a full-scale invasion in September 1980, changed the calculus in the most visceral way imaginable. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons, mustard, gas, and nerve agents, including tabun and sarin, against Iranian soldiers in the trenches and against Kurdish civilians in the town of Halabja, where an estimated 5,000 people died in a single horrific attack in March 1988. The international community's response was muted to the point of complicity. The United States, then aligned with Iraq as a counterweight to revolutionary Iran, provided Saddam with satellite intelligence and looked the other way. Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who would later become Iran's president, reportedly told a group of Revolutionary Guard commanders during the war that we should have had a nuclear deterrent, then Saddam would never have dared. Iran's leadership came to a cold and bitter realization. In a hostile world where international law offered no protection and Western powers actively supported your enemy, strategic deterrence was not a luxury, but a matter of national survival. By the late 1980s, the nuclear program had quietly restarted, this time not with American help, but with covert assistance from Abdul Qadir Khan, the Pakistani metallurgist who had stolen centrifuge designs from the Dutch company Urenco in the 1970s and built Pakistan's bomb. Khan's proliferation network, one of the most extraordinary black market operations in history, supplied Iran with blueprints for pwn, centrifuges, component parts, and technical expertise, all shipped through intermediaries in Dubai, Malaysia, and Turkey. China provided uranium hexafluoride and assistance with uranium conversion facilities, while Russia eventually stepped in to complete the long-abandoned Bushehr reactor. What had once been an American-backed energy project, conceived in the hopeful spirit of atoms for peace, was now something else entirely, clandestine, resentful, and driven by a siege mentality, and the world would spend the next 4 decades trying to figure out exactly what it had become. To understand why Iran's nuclear program generates such visceral alarm among intelligence agencies and world leaders, one must understand the science of uranium enrichment and the terrifyingly thin line that separates civilian fuel from the core of a weapon. Natural uranium, as it comes out of the ground in mines from Kazakhstan to Canada to Iran's own deposits at Sarghand and Guchine, is composed almost entirely of the isotope U-238, a stable, relatively harmless form of uranium that makes up roughly 99.3% of the ore. Less than 1% is the fissile isotope U-235, the rare and precious variant whose atomic nucleus is unstable enough to split when struck by a neutron, releasing enormous energy and more neutrons in a self-sustaining chain reaction. To be useful in a standard light water power reactor, uranium must be enriched to between 3 and 5%, U-235, a product known as low-enriched uranium, or LEU, the same material that fuels the roughly 440 commercial nuclear reactors operating worldwide, from France's vast reactor fleet to the plants dotting the American Midwest. To fuel a nuclear bomb, however, that same material must be enriched to roughly 90%, a threshold known as weapons-grade uranium, or WGU. The difference sounds enormous in percentage terms, but the physics are deceptive. Due to the mathematics of separative work units, or SWU, roughly 70% of the total effort required to reach weapons grade is already accomplished by the time uranium reaches just 5% enrichment. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the non-proliferation regime. what physicists sometimes call the enrichment paradox. Any nation that can make reactor fuel is already most of the way to making bomb fuel. The process Iran uses to achieve this enrichment is gas centrifuge technology, and it is here that the ghost of A.Q. Khan looms largest. Uranium ore is first converted into uranium hexafluoride, a volatile compound that becomes a gas when gently heated. This gas is fed into tall, thin cylinders centrifuges that spin at breathtaking speeds, sometimes exceeding 60,000 revolutions per minute, faster than the turbine of a jet engine. At these velocities, the slight mass difference between U-235 and the heavier U-238 causes the lighter isotope to concentrate near the center of the spinning cylinder, while the heavier one is present, pushed outward toward the wall. The enriched fraction is siphoned off and fed into the next centrifuge, and thousands of these machines are linked together in cascades, each stage nudging the purity of U-235 a little higher, like an impossibly precise molecular sieve. Iran's earliest centrifuge models, the IR-1, were essentially copies of the Pakistani Pone design, themselves derived from the Urenco, Snor, and Sinor designs that Khan had stolen from the FDO laboratory in Almelo, the Netherlands, in the early 1970s. The IR-1 machines were notoriously fragile. Their rotors, made from aluminum rather than more advanced carbon fiber composites, were prone to cracking and vibration failures, and Western intelligence analysts initially took some comfort in their crude performance, estimating that each machine could produce only about 0.8 separative work units per year. But Iran was patient, and its engineers were learning. The IR-2M represented a meaningful step forward, incorporating carbon fiber rotors that could spin faster and longer without failure, roughly tripling the output of the IR-1. More concerning still was the development of the IR-4, IR-6, and the advanced IR-8 model. The IR-6, which Iran began deploying in significant numbers after the collapse of the JCPOA, can enrich uranium roughly 10 times faster than the aging IR-1, meaning Iran can produce the same amount of material in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the machines. This matters enormously because the concept at the heart of every intelligence estimate, every IAEA report, and every emergency meeting at the White House Situation Room is breakout time, the estimated period Iran would need, starting from a political decision to do so, to produce approximately 25 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, the estimated minimum for a single implosion-type weapon. Each generation of more efficient centrifuge compresses that timeline further, and the margin for diplomatic or military response shrinks accordingly. Uranium, however, is not the only path to a bomb, and the history of nuclear proliferation shows that some nations have preferred the alternative. There is also plutonium, and this is where the Arak heavy water reactor enters the story as a second source of deep international anxiety. Unlike light water reactors, such as the Russian-built facility at Bushehr, which use ordinary water as both a coolant and a neutron moderator and produce relatively small quantities of plutonium in their spent fuel, heavy water reactors use deuterium oxide water, in which the hydrogen atoms carry an extra neutron, and are far more efficient at bombarding U-238 with neutrons to transmute it into plutonium-239. The isotope used in the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The reactor Iran was constructing at Arak, designated the IR-40, was modeled loosely on older research reactor designs and had a projected thermal output of 40 megawatts. Western analysts calculated that once operational, it could theoretically produce 8 to 10 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium per year, enough for 1 or 2 bombs annually. Assuming Iran could also build the reprocessing facilities needed to extract the plutonium from the highly radioactive spent fuel rods, a dangerous and technically demanding process but not one beyond Iran's capabilities. The choice of heavy water was itself suspicious. Iran has no fleet of CANDU-type power reactors that would justify a heavy water production capability, and the heavy water production plant, built adjacent to the Arak site, could produce far more than the reactor required, raising questions about what other purposes the surplus might serve. This dual pathway concern uranium enrichment at Natanz and Fordo, alongside plutonium production at Arak, is precisely what made the international community so uneasy, because it meant Iran could potentially pursue a weapon through whichever route proved faster, less scrutinized, or more resilient to sabotage, hedging its bets like a gambler placing chips on multiple numbers. The geography of Iran's nuclear program tells its own story of deliberate concealment, strategic dispersal, and physical hardening against attack, reflecting a nation that fully expects to be bombed. Natanz, located in the arid flatlands of Isfahan province, roughly 200 kilometers south of Tehran, is the crown jewel of Iran's enrichment enterprise and the facility most familiar to the public from satellite photographs. Its existence was unknown to the outside world until August 2002, when Alireza Jafarzadeh, a spokesman for the exiled Iranian opposition group known as the National Council of Resistance of Iran, held a press conference in Washington and revealed that Iran was constructing a massive underground enrichment facility in the desert. The revelation sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies, which had failed to detect the construction despite years of satellite surveillance. Above ground, Natanz features a pilot enrichment plant, where Iran first tested its centrifuge cascades. But the real strategic asset lies below. Two enormous underground halls, designated Halls A and B, each roughly the size of a football field, buried under approximately 8 meters of reinforced concrete and a thick layer of earth, specifically engineered to survive aerial bombardment, including strikes by precision-guided munitions. At its peak authorized capacity, these halls were designed to house over 50,000 centrifuges. The complex is surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries and Iranian air defenses, including Russian-supplied 300 missile systems delivered in 2016, after years of diplomatic wrangling, stand guard over the site. Even further from the reach of conventional military force is Fordo, officially known as the Fordo Fuel Enrichment Plant, a facility whose very location embodies Iran's determination to create a nuclear fait accompli that cannot be easily undone by force. Built deep inside a mountain near the ancient city of Qom, one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, Fordo's existence was publicly disclosed on September 25, 2009. In a dramatic joint announcement by President Barack Obama, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, Obama's tone was stern and measured. The size and configuration of this facility is inconsistent with a peaceful program, he said, standing between the British and French leaders in a carefully choreographed display of Western unity. Satellite imagery later revealed that the facility was tunneled into the granite flank of a mountain, accessible through a road carved into the rock, with the centrifuge halls buried under an estimated 80 meters of stone and earth. Many analysts believe that even the most powerful conventional weapon in the American arsenal, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound behemoth designed specifically to defeat hardened and deeply buried targets, might not be able to fully destroy Fordo's centrifuge halls, though it could potentially collapse the tunnel entrances and disable ventilation systems. The facility's location near Qom also adds a calculated political dimension. Any military strike would risk being portrayed as an attack on a holy city, inflaming Shia communities worldwide. Then there is Parchin, a sprawling military complex southeast of Tehran, covering roughly 7 square kilometers, which the International Atomic Energy Agency has long suspected of hosting a very different kind of nuclear work. Unlike Natanz and Fordo, which are enrichment sites, Parchin is linked to weaponization research, specifically high explosive tests related to the development of a nuclear trigger. In 2004, the IAEA's lead investigator on the Iran file, the Finnish diplomat Olli Heinonen, requested access to a specific building within the complex, later identified in satellite imagery as a large containment chamber suitable for hydrodynamic testing. The kind of experiment where conventional explosives are detonated around a non-fissile surrogate to test the implosion geometry needed to compress a plutonium or uranium core to supercritical density. Iran permitted 2 IAEA visits to Parchin in 2005, but subsequently blocked all further access for years. During that time, satellite photographs taken by commercial companies, including Digital Globe, showed disturbing activity. Buildings were demolished, soil was removed and replaced, roads were asphalted over, and the suspect building was shrouded in a pink-colored enclosure, all consistent with a systematic cleanup operation designed to eliminate forensic traces of nuclear-related experiments. When IAEA inspectors were finally allowed to take environmental samples from the site in 2015 as part of the JCPOA negotiations, they detected man-made uranium particles, though Iran offered alternative explanations and the agency's conclusions remained carefully hedged. These suspicions about weaponization found their most dramatic and politically explosive confirmation in the early months of 2018, when Israel's Mossad intelligence agency executed one of the most audacious espionage operations of the 21st century. According to accounts later confirmed by multiple intelligence officials, a team of Mossad operatives had spent years identifying the location of Iran's nuclear archive, a massive trove of documents, photographs, videos, and digital files that recorded the details of Iran's past weapons research. The files were stored in an unassuming warehouse in the Shorabad district of southern Tehran, a neighborhood of industrial buildings and anonymous commercial spaces. On a single night in January 2018, a team of agents broke into the facility, cracked dozens of giant safes, and extracted roughly half a ton of material, approximately 55,000 pages of documents, and 183 CDs, containing an additional 55,000 digital files. They loaded the material into cargo vehicles and spirited it out of the country, reportedly crossing the border into Azerbaijan, all without triggering an Iranian security response. It was, in the words of one former CIA official, quoted anonymously, one of the greatest intelligence heists in history. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu unveiled portions of this trove in a dramatic televised presentation on April 30, 2018, standing before cameras with shelves of binders stacked behind him as props. Iran lied, he declared, his voice rising for emphasis. Big time. The documents, Netanyahu claimed, proved the existence of Project Ahmad, a structured Iranian program active primarily between 1999 and 2003, with the explicit goal of designing, producing, and testing 5 nuclear warheads, each with a yield of 10 kilotons, roughly the explosive power of the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. The project had reportedly been led by Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a shadowy physics professor and brigadier general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, whom the IAEA had been trying to interview for years without success. The archive reportedly detailed work across the 5 essential components any nation needs to produce a deliverable nuclear weapon. First, the production of sufficient fissile material, meaning enough enriched uranium or separated plutonium to sustain a chain reaction and generate a nuclear yield. Second, the weaponization process itself, specifically the engineering of the weapon's pit, the hollow sphere of fissile material at the heart of an implosion-type bomb, which must be manufactured to exacting tolerances, often from cast uranium metal machined to precise dimensions. Third, a triggering system involving high-speed electronics and exploding bridge-wire detonators capable of firing simultaneously with microsecond precision to create a perfectly symmetrical implosion wave. Even a tiny asymmetry can cause the fissile core to squirt out rather than compress, resulting in a fizzle rather than a full nuclear yield. Fourth, miniaturization, the complex engineering challenge of making the warhead small enough and light enough to fit inside the nose cone of a ballistic missile, a process that requires sophisticated computer modeling, extensive testing with surrogate materials, and a deep understanding of aerodynamics and re-entry physics. Fifth, a reliable delivery system. which in Iran's case means its growing arsenal of ballistic missiles, including the Shahab-3, a medium-range missile derived from North Korea's No-Dong design with a range of approximately 1,300 kilometers, enough to reach Tel Aviv and its more advanced successors. The Ghadar and Etemad variants, as well as the solid-fueled Sejil, which is harder to detect before launch because it requires no time-consuming fueling process. Iran has consistently denied pursuing a weapon, and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has even issued a fatwa, a religious decree declaring nuclear weapons to be haram, forbidden under Islamic law, though skeptics note that no written text of this fatwa has ever been produced, and that Islamic jurisprudence permits deception in the defense of the faith under the doctrine of taqiyya. The IAEA's own assessment, contained in a landmark 2011 report compiled under Director General Yukiya Amano, concluded that Iran had conducted activities relevant to the development of a nuclear explosive device in a structured program before 2003, and that some activities may have continued afterward, though the agency stopped short of declaring that Iran had made a definitive decision to build a bomb. While diplomats argued in the gilded conference rooms of Vienna and Geneva, and intelligence analysts pored over satellite imagery in windowless offices in Langley and Tel Aviv, a very different kind of campaign was being waged in the shadows, a covert war of sabotage and assassination that operated entirely outside the bounds of international law. In June 2010, cybersecurity researchers at the small Belarusian firm Virus Blockada discovered a piece of malicious software on an Iranian client's computer that was unlike anything the digital security world had ever encountered. It was eventually named Stuxnet, and its sophistication stunned even veteran malware analysts. The worm exploited an unprecedented 4 separate zero-day vulnerabilities, previously unknown flaws in Microsoft Windows to propagate through networks, jumping from computer to computer via infected USB drives. But Stuxnet was not designed to steal data, empty bank accounts, or spy on communications. It was designed to destroy physical infrastructure. Believed to be a joint creation of the United States National Security Agency under a program reportedly codenamed Olympic Games and initiated under President George W. Bush before being dramatically expanded under President Obama, and Israel's elite Signals Intelligence Unit, Unit 8200. Stuxnet specifically targeted the Siemens Step 7 programmable logic controllers that governed the operation of Iran's IR-1 centrifuges at Natanz. Once it infiltrated the industrial control systems, the worm did something diabolically clever. It periodically commanded the centrifuges to accelerate far beyond their safe operating speed, up to 1,410 Hz. Well past the 1,064 Hz, at which the aluminum rotors were designed to spin, and then suddenly decelerated them, subjecting the delicate machines to stresses that caused bearings to fail, rotors to crack, and entire cascades to crash. Simultaneously, Stuxnet fed perfectly normal operational readings back to the monitoring screens in the control room, so the Iranian engineers watching their displays saw nothing amiss, even as their centrifuges were tearing themselves apart in the adjacent hall. It was, as the cybersecurity journalist Kim Zeta described it in her definitive account, an invisible hand reaching into a factory and sabotaging it from within. Estimates suggest Stuxnet destroyed roughly 1,000 of Iran's approximately 9,000 operating centrifuges and set back the enrichment program by 1 to 2 years. Ralph Langner, the German industrial control systems expert who first decoded Stuxnet's payload, called it a game changer, the digital equivalent of a military strike. For the first time in history, a line of computer code had crossed the boundary between the virtual and the physical, demonstrating that a weapon could be delivered not by bomber or missile, but by a USB stick slipped into the pocket of an unwitting technician. The shadow war did not remain digital, and its human cost was borne by men whose names most of the world would never know. Between 2010 and 2012, at least 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated in a campaign of chilling precision that bore the hallmarks of a professional intelligence service. The pattern was almost always the same. A scientist driving to work or leaving home in the morning would be approached by one or two assailants on motorcycles who would attach a small magnetic bomb, a sticky bomb, to the door of the car and then speed away into Tehran's chaotic traffic. Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a particle physicist at Tehran University, was killed by a booby-trapped motorcycle parked outside his home in January 2010. Majid Shahriari, a nuclear engineer involved in reactor projects, was killed by a sticky bomb in November 2010. On the same morning, in a separate attack, his colleague Feridun Abbasi Davani survived an identical attempt when he noticed the device and managed to pull himself and his wife from the car before it detonated. Abbasi Davani would later be appointed head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, a defiant gesture by the regime. Dariush Rezai-Najad, a young physicist linked to high-voltage detonator research, was shot dead in front of his wife and child in July 2011. Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, a director at the Natanz enrichment facility, was killed by yet another sticky bomb in January 2012. Iran publicly blamed Israel and the United States. Israel never officially confirmed or denied involvement, though retired Mossad officials have spoken with barely concealed pride in off-the-record conversations with journalists. But the most consequential assassination, the one that Iran's leadership called an act of war, came on November 27, 2020, on a quiet highway in Absard, a small town east of Tehran. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the physicist and Revolutionary Guard Brigadier General who had led Project Ahmad and was widely regarded as the indispensable man of Iran's nuclear weapons program, was traveling in a convoy when his vehicle was struck by gunfire. Initial reports described a team of gunmen, but the truth that emerged was even more extraordinary. According to accounts published by the New York Times and confirmed by Iranian officials, the attack was carried out using a Belgian-made FN MAG machine gun that had been smuggled into Iran in pieces, reassembled, and mounted on a Nissan pickup truck parked on the roadside. The weapon was operated entirely by remote control via satellite link, using artificial intelligence-assisted facial recognition to identify Fakhrizadeh and fire with precision, compensating for the half-second communication delay between the satellite and the gun. No assassin was physically present at the scene. The truck subsequently self-destructed with a built-in explosive charge to eliminate forensic evidence. Fakhrizadeh, struck by at least 13 bullets, was dead before he reached the hospital. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif called the killing an act of state terror and pointed the finger directly at Israel. The message to Iran's nuclear establishment was unmistakable. No one was beyond reach. Alongside these targeted killings, a series of mysterious explosions rocked Iranian nuclear and military facilities over the years, incidents that Iran often attributed to accidents, but that carried the unmistakable scent of sabotage. In November 2011, a massive blast at the Al Ghadir missile base near Bidgane killed 17 Revolutionary Guard members, including Major General Hassan Tehrani Moghadam, the architect of Iran's ballistic missile program, an explosion so powerful it was detected by seismographs as far away as Turkey. In July 2020, a carefully targeted explosion damaged a newly built advanced centrifuge assembly hall at Natanz, a building where Iran was preparing to manufacture and test its most sophisticated IR-6 and IR-9 machines, setting back advanced centrifuge production by months. In April 2021, an apparent sabotage of the electrical distribution system at Natanz caused a blackout that damaged thousands of centrifuges and was attributed by Iran to an explosive device smuggled into the facility's internal power grid. Whether acts of state-sponsored sabotage or genuine industrial accidents, these incidents served a dual strategic purpose: physically slowing Iran's progress and psychologically reminding every scientist, engineer, and technician in the program that they were being watched, that the walls had ears, and that the next explosion might come from inside their own laboratory. Against this harrowing backdrop of covert warfare and mutual suspicion, diplomacy produced its most significant and improbable achievement in the Swiss city of Lausanne and the Austrian capital of Vienna between 2013 and 2015. The opening came from an unexpected direction: the election of Hassan Rouhani as Iran's president in June 2013, a relatively pragmatic cleric who had campaigned on a promise to resolve the nuclear standoff and end the economic sanctions that were devastating Iran's economy. Inflation had soared above 40%, the currency had lost two-thirds of its value, and oil exports, the lifeblood of the state, had been slashed by more than half. Rouhani, who had previously served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator from 2003 to 2005, appointed the urbane, American-educated diplomat Mohammad Javad Zarif as his foreign minister and gave him a mandate to cut a deal. On the American side, the Obama administration had been quietly laying the groundwork through a secret back channel in Oman, where American and Iranian officials had been meeting clandestinely since 2012, facilitated by Sultan Qaboos. After months of grueling negotiations in Geneva, Lausanne, and Vienna, marathon sessions that sometimes lasted through the night and nearly collapsed multiple times over technical details, on July 14, 2015, Iran and 6 world powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, collectively known as the 5+1, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, universally known as the JCPOA, or simply the Iran deal. The agreement was announced by a visibly exhausted but elated Zarif and EU High Representative Federica Mogherini at a press conference in Vienna's Palais Coburg, a luxury hotel that had served as the negotiating venue. "This is a historic moment," Mogherini said. Under its terms, Iran agreed to slash its stockpile of enriched uranium from roughly 10,000 kilograms to just 300, a reduction of 98%. Enrichment would be capped at 3.67% purity, far below weapons grade. Iran would reduce its operating centrifuges from approximately 19,000 to roughly 5,060. All of them, first-generation IR-1 machines, and would remove and store its more advanced models under IAEA seal. The underground facility at Fordow would be converted from an enrichment plant into a research center, producing medical isotopes, with no fissile material permitted on site. The Arak heavy water reactor would be redesigned with an international team to minimize plutonium production, and its original calandria, the reactor core vessel, would be filled with concrete and rendered permanently unusable. Most crucially, Iran would submit to the most intrusive international inspections regime ever negotiated under the IAEA's additional protocol, including provisions for managed access to undeclared sites under a dispute resolution process. In return, crippling economic sanctions imposed by the United Nations, the European Union, and the United States that had strangled Iran's oil exports, frozen billions in overseas assets, and cut the country off from the global SWIFT banking network were to be lifted. President Obama, addressing the nation from the White House, called the deal the strongest non-proliferation agreement ever negotiated, and added, with characteristic precision, "This deal is not built on trust, it is built on verification." For a brief, fragile moment, the agreement was hailed as a triumph of multilateral diplomacy, proof that even the most intractable disputes could yield to patient, creative negotiation. Iran's breakout time, which had shrunk to an estimated 2 to 3 months before the deal, was pushed back to approximately 1 year, enough time, in theory, for the international community to detect a breakout attempt and respond. That moment did not last, and its unraveling would become one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the early 21st century. From the beginning, the JCPOA had powerful enemies. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had waged an extraordinary public campaign against the deal, even taking the unprecedented step of addressing a joint session of the US Congress in March 2015, without the Obama administration's approval, a breach of diplomatic protocol that infuriated the White House. This is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal. We're better off without it, Netanyahu declared to thunderous applause from Republican lawmakers. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, terrified of both Iran's nuclear ambitions and what they perceived as American abandonment of its traditional Sunni allies, were equally hostile. Within American politics, the deal became a partisan lightning rod, with Republicans unanimously opposed and many Democrats uneasy. When Donald Trump was elected president in November 2016, the JCPOA's fate was effectively sealed. On May 8, 2018, in a televised ceremony in the White House diplomatic reception room, Trump announced that the United States would unilaterally withdraw from the agreement. This was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made, he said, signing a presidential memorandum reimposing sanctions. It didn't bring calm. It didn't bring peace. And it never will. The decision was made over the objections of nearly every American ally. The unanimous recommendation of US intelligence agencies that Iran was in compliance with the deal, and the personal pleas of European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, who had visited Washington just days earlier in a failed attempt to persuade Trump to stay in. Washington reimposed punishing sanctions under a strategy branded maximum pressure, targeting Iran's oil exports, banking system, metals sector, and even individual government officials. The economic impact was devastating. Iran's oil exports, which had recovered to roughly 2.5 million barrels per day under the JCPOA, plummeted to as little as 200,000 barrels per day. The currency collapsed again, and ordinary Iranians faced shortages of imported medicines, industrial parts, and consumer goods. Iran, after waiting approximately a year for the remaining European signatories, Britain, France, and Germany, operating through a mechanism called INSTEX, designed to facilitate non-dollar trade to find a meaningful way to preserve the deal's economic benefits, concluded that Europe could not or would not deliver. Tehran then began a calibrated strategy of methodically violating its nuclear commitments, each step designed to increase pressure while remaining technically reversible. Iran breached the 300-kilogram stockpile limit. It enriched beyond the 3.67% cap, first to 4.5%, then to 20% in January 2021, and then, in a move that sent shockwaves through non-proliferation circles and drew urgent closed-door briefings at the Pentagon and the Israeli Ministry of Defense, they began enriching uranium to 60% purity in April 2021, a level that has no plausible civilian application and sits on the very doorstep of weapons-grade material. Advanced centrifuges were installed at both Natanz and Fordo, including cascades of IR-6 machines that could enrich far more quickly than the antiquated IR-1s permitted under the deal. Iran also curtailed IAEA inspectors' access, disabling cameras and monitoring equipment at key facilities, creating gaps in the agency's surveillance that Director General Rafael Grossi described publicly as very concerning, and that left the international community increasingly flying blind. The physics of enrichment, as noted earlier, are non-linear and unforgiving. Going from 60% to 90% requires far less separative work, fewer centrifuge cascades, and far less time than going from natural uranium to 60%. By the time international inspectors reported these developments in their quarterly reports, Iran's theoretical breakout time had collapsed from the JCPOA's carefully constructed one-year cushion back to a matter of weeks, perhaps even days, depending on which estimates one trusts and how many centrifuges Iran chooses to feed simultaneously. The deal that had taken over a decade of diplomacy to construct had been dismantled in a matter of months, and the nuclear clock was ticking faster than it ever had before. The stakes of this standoff radiate far beyond Iran's borders, reaching into every capital and military planning room in the Middle East and beyond, touching on questions that go to the very heart of the global non-proliferation order. built painstakingly since the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968, Israel has maintained for decades that a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat, not merely a strategic inconvenience, but a danger to the very survival of the Jewish state. This conviction is rooted not only in Iran's geographic proximity and the range of its ballistic missiles, but in the rhetoric of Iranian leaders themselves. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's incendiary statements about Israel vanishing from the page of time, the death to Israel chants that are a ritual feature of state-organized rallies in Tehran, and the regime's financial and military support for Hezbollah and Hamas, groups committed to Israel's destruction. Successive Israeli prime ministers have drawn explicit red lines, none more dramatically than Benjamin Netanyahu at the United Nations General Assembly on September 27, 2012, when he stood before the world body, holding a cartoon diagram of a bomb, a simple drawing with a lit fuse, and physically drew a red line across it with a marker. "A red line should be drawn right here," he said, pointing to the diagram's upper section representing 90% enrichment, "before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb." The image was mocked in some quarters and praised in others, but the underlying message was deadly serious. Israel would not permit Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and if diplomacy failed, the military force remained on the table. Israeli military planners have invested billions in the capability to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, including the acquisition of advanced F-35I stealth fighters configured for long-range strike missions, the development of specialized penetrating munitions, and the establishment of forward basing agreements and aerial refueling capabilities that would make such a mission logistically feasible, though enormously risky. The question of whether to launch a preemptive attack, echoing Israel's destruction of Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 and its strike on a suspected Syrian reactor at Al-Kibar in 2007, has been debated at the highest levels of Israel's security establishment for over a decade, with former Mossad directors including Meir Dagan and former Shin Bet chiefs reportedly opposing a unilateral strike as likely to delay but not destroy Iran's program while triggering a catastrophic regional war. But the implications extend further still, into a realm that keeps non-proliferation experts awake at night. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated bluntly in an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes in March 2018 that if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. This was not idle talk. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in its relationship with Pakistan, which already possesses nuclear weapons, and persistent unconfirmed reports suggest an understanding between Riyadh and Islamabad that Pakistani warheads could be transferred to Saudi Arabia in extremis, a claim both governments deny. Egypt, the most populous Arab state and a historic regional leader with its own mothballed nuclear research program, would face enormous domestic and strategic pressure to pursue a weapon rather than accept permanent nuclear inferiority to a Persian rival. Turkey, a NATO member with ambitions to lead the Sunni Muslim world and a president in Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has publicly questioned why some nations are allowed nuclear weapons and others are not, represents yet another potential proliferation risk. Even the smaller Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, which already operates peaceful nuclear reactors built by South Korea, and Qatar and Bahrain would be forced to recalculate their security postures in a nuclear Middle East. The prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran thus threatens to trigger a cascade of proliferation across the most volatile region on Earth, a domino effect that would shatter the non-proliferation regime, overwhelm the IAEA's inspection capabilities, and transform the Middle East into a landscape where multiple states with ancient rivalries, territorial disputes, and sectarian hatreds all possess humanity's most destructive technology. Henry Kissinger, reflecting on the dangers of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, once observed that the danger is not that nuclear weapons will be used, but that they will become instruments of diplomatic blackmail and that their spread will make accidents, miscalculations, and unauthorized use statistically inevitable. What began as Eisenhower's hopeful gift of peaceful atoms offered to a grateful ally under the bright lights of the United Nations in 1953, has metastasized into one of the most dangerous and intractable crises of the modern age, a slow-motion confrontation where the distance between peace and catastrophe is measured in the purity of spinning uranium gas, and where its resolution or its escalation will shape the geopolitics of the 21st century in ways that we are only beginning, and perhaps failing, to comprehend. And so the centrifuges keep spinning. Somewhere beneath the mountains of Fordo, inside halls carved from rock that has existed since before Persia had a name, rotors hum at 60,000 revolutions per minute, faster than sound, faster than diplomacy, faster, perhaps, than the world's ability to decide what to do about them. It is worth remembering that Robert Oppenheimer, the man who built the first atomic bomb in the deserts of Los Alamos in 1945, spent the rest of his life haunted by what he had unleashed. But it was his less famous colleague, the physicist Rabi, who offered the quieter and more chilling reflection. Years after Hiroshima, Rabi said, "It was as if we had opened a door into a very dark room, and there was no way to close it again." Iran's nuclear story is that door. It was opened in 1953 with a handshake and a smile under the banner of Atoms for Peace. 70 years later, no one, not Washington, not Tehran, not the inspectors in Vienna, not the spies in Tel Aviv, has figured out how to close it. The only certainty is this: whatever happens next, the world will not have the luxury of looking away. Thank you for watching. Until next time.